As Jeff said, my name is Eva, and I've been in Appalachian Studies concentration for the past 4 years. And not only that, but I've also been working within Southern Appalachia as well. My research has combined a lot of my passions together, and I paralleled the pedagogical model called the Inside Out Prison Exchange Program, which brings college students and incarcerated students together in the same learning environment, and the education reforms in Southern Appalachia. For my research, I argued that because of the historical experience around education reforms in the Southern Appalachian region, this model should be incorporated as a reform to higher education in this region. First off, I want to say that this is more of a conversation than anything else. My research is contributing to larger discourses around education, incarceration, and regionality. Before we dig deeper into this discourse, I want to prepare you. Throughout this presentation, I will share some of my own story, share some pertinent historical background, show you how I did my research, and share some of the conclusions that I came to. By the end of this presentation, you shall see the implications of my research and ways in which one can further the discourse. In order to understand this research, it is important to understand where I'm coming from and some of my story. Through working on issues of environmental degradation in Southern Appalachia, I was arrested and spent 6 days in a county jail. In jail, and after I left, I experienced extreme rage towards our criminal justice system. Through this rage, I decided to learn as much as I could about our justice system. I took classes, I attended workshops, and over winter break, I attended a week-long intensive training in Philadelphia through the Inside Out Prison Exchange Program for instructors. As an Appalachian Studies concentration, I had an interesting revelation. There are no Inside Out Prison Exchange programs in Southern Appalachian region, not at colleges, universities, or correctional facilities. Therefore, I chose to dig further to see if I could make the case for the implementation of these programs specifically here in this region. First off, let's get an idea of where I'm talking about. I define Southern Appalachia as East Tennessee, Western North Carolina, Eastern Kentucky, Southwest Virginia, and Southern West Virginia, as you can see here in this map. This area is defined by the Appalachian Regional Commission as South Central Appalachia. In this region, the people have been oppressed, misrepresented, and misunderstood for as long as possible. From the genocide of indigenous people to convict leasing, and the classification of the people as less than human, the people in Southern Appalachia have been generalized and stereotyped by external sources. With this deep-seated misrepresentation, the education system has gone under many education reforms. In 1902, the first settlement school was founded in Appalachia. These schools were largely run by missionary workers and women coming down from the north to teach. Later, in the 1960s and 70s, came a second wave of education reform to the region. Appalachian volunteers and VISTA workers, often called poverty workers, came out of Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty. These volunteers were young and often came from the urban centers of Appalachia and from the north. Both settlement schools, Appalachian volunteers, and VISTA programs came out of a prescription model of education. These workers believed to know exactly what would make the uneducated educated, and their goal was to civilize the backward hillbilly. While both of these models were being implemented to the region, there was another model coming out of the framework with a much different view of education. In 1932, the Highlander Folk School, now the Highlander Research and Education Center, was founded by Miles Horton. Horton's views of education came from a sense they were all experts and that the knowledge needed to be found within the group here in this room. This is called popular education. I parallel the successes of the Highlander Center responding to regional needs to the inside-out model of education. Understanding the entire prison system within this presentation is an unrealistic goal. However, it is important to have some context here around background information, around incarceration in the United States and in Southern Appalachia. First off, the prison industrial complex, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, simply means the interconnectedness between corporations, the media, and politics, which all benefit from the incarceration of human beings. Angela Davis describes this process is driven by the ideologies of racism and the pursuit for profit. Now, knowing what the prison industrial complex is, here's some other information around the prison around incarceration in the United States. With 5% of the world's population, the United States holds over 25% of the incarcerated population in the world, with over 2.2 million people being incarcerated. Not only that, but a disproportionate number of African American and Latino people are incarcerated. According to John Eason, a criminology professor, during the prison boom in the 1990s, the South had the most new prisons built out of any other region in the United States. For example, this photo here is of a prison built on top of an old mountaintop removal site in southern Virginia. More prisons equals more bodies to fill with more spaces to fill with bodies. Now, it is known that through much research and data collection, the educational opportunities reduces recidivism, which is the rate at which someone will return to prison after the reentry process. However, in 1994, Pell Grant funding was eliminated for those who were incarcerated. This decreased accessibility to educational opportunities drastically for people who are incarcerated. Yet, 20 years later, educational opportunities are up to their pre-1994 levels. Yet these programs are mostly privately funded or funded by very specific government grants. Like I said before, the Inside Out program is a college course designed for inside students who are incarcerated, and outside students who come from a college or university. There are equal numbers of inside and outside students who participate in the class. These courses were originally taught within criminal justice departments at Temple University because it was founded by Lori Pampa, who was a professor. Yet now, faculty throughout the United States teach numerous subjects through this program. All courses have very similar components to them and have the ability to be flexible with other parts. But the core components of a course is that all faculty and students go by their first name. The classroom is set up in a circle and is oftentimes within the prison setting because those students do not have the opportunity to leave that setting, but we can go into that setting. And that there is a group project at the end of each semester where inside students and outside students take on a culminating project. Since 1997, these programs have been widely successful, with faculty and students sharing that they come out of these courses transformed by their experiences. Seeing many parallels with the Highlander Center and the Inside Out programs, I decided to take each model apart and look at some specific examples. Both models do not adhere to the classic banking model of education, which is focusing on memorizing and regurgitating information. Rather, both models focus on community-based learning. In order to dig deeper, into these parallels, I used a number of different informational sources. I had the ability to go to the archives at the Highlander Center, which provided me with the opportunity to see unique firsthand accounts from Miles Horton. I also used the book We Make the Road by Walking, which is a series of conversations with Horton about his process and pedagogical theories. I was able to conduct 2 personal interviews with current and retired Inside Out faculty, and I used the book Turning Teaching Inside Out as another primary resource. I was able to make parallels between community-based learning, facilitation practices, trust building, and the cross-cultural relationships within the Highlander Center and Inside Out programs. Through looking at primary documents from Miles Horton, he clearly spells out how he sees community-based education. He shares that community-based education programs combine human growth and development with community growth and development, meaning there are multiple processes happening at the same time. The methodology of community-based education gives equal weight to feelings and cultural pride as it does to perceived intellect and vocational ability. Community-based education also acknowledges and lives within the differences held within a group. For example, as you can see in the image here, this is of an integrated workshop at the Highlander Center during the citizenship schools in the early 1940s and Jim Crow South. The Highlander Center has modeled many different successful community-based education programs in the past and even today. Programs range from adult and worker education programs to programs like Seeds of Fire, which does youth empowerment work currently in Appalachia. Like these programs, Inside Out has the ability to break down barriers like the Highlander Center did in the Jim Crow South. One successful way each of these programs do that is shown through this quote of an Inside student. He shares that programs that bring outside people into our world behind these fences are a great avenue for connecting humans with humans and eyes with eyes. This parallels directly with what one student said to Horton in 1965, which was that people in college and people in the community are each seeking knowledge to put to good use in their daily lives. In addition to the process of community-based education, both Inside Out and the Highlander Center utilize tools of facilitation by leading courses with an invisible hand, which means facilitators guide the process of the classroom rather than telling the answers or lecturing in the classroom. Dan Buchan, professor and dean of the School for Education at Marinette College, shares that Inside Out is an educational experience so structured that it literally teaches itself at the very same time as it destabilizes our traditional notions of teaching and learning. He is referring to the process of taking one's learning into one's own hands rather than through the traditional thinking model. I found the concept of trust to be one of the most compelling reasons an Inside Out model would be healthy for Southern Appalachia. Although Inside Out programs take on quite the literal meaning of inside students being inside the walls of prison and outside students being outside the walls, the terms inside and outside take on their own metaphorical meanings within Southern Appalachia. With outsiders coming into Southern Appalachia for over 150 years to exploit the land and people, many, understandably, have had a hard time trusting people and programs that do not come from the region itself. Therefore, to literally break these barriers, bringing students from the region into prison allows for the literal and metaphorical breaking of insider and outsider. One student from the training that I went to shared that we are here to arrest and interrogate labels, acknowledging that each of us comes with an attached label, such as prisoner, redneck, inmate, or hillbilly. But within the classroom and into their greater communities, those labels are broken down to friend, person, and classmate. Another important aspect of building trust is the concept of service. Historically, Southern Appalachia has been a place where the people needed saving. Therefore, programs like Vista were created. However, the Highlander Center and Inside Out take on a different approach. Inside Out sees itself as mutually beneficial for all parties, facilitators, inside students, and outside students. No one is there to serve one another, but rather to learn with one another. This is a much more holistic model of seeing education in Southern Appalachia. Lastly, both Inside Out and the Highlander Center are situated within certain political, social, and cultural spaces. Both programs see regional identity as being an important aspect to one's individual experience. Both models place weight on people's lived experiences and place value on sharing those experiences within a group. With both of these models, the participants are becoming a community in a very specific context and then leave and disperse afterwards. Through my research, I have come to the conclusion that the Inside Out programs would fit well within the historical experiences held in Southern Appalachia. Inside Out is a holistic, non-prescription-based pedagogical model which must be initiated from within, meaning that no outside parties from the region can impose the program. Faculty who teach in Southern Appalachia must have the inspiration to begin a program. Also, the implementation of Inside Out programs is in addition to other efforts in the Appalachian region around prison and educational justice. Paralleling Inside Out Prison Exchange Program with the Highlander Center is just one way to make this case for implementation. This is in no way the answer to finding liberation for these communities. However, it is one way to look at the benefits of the further implementation of such programs. Aside from doing this research for the past 16 weeks, I've also been in conversation with Warren Wilson faculty and administration for implementing a program here at Warren Wilson. I hope that this research provides not only a backbone for the implementation here, but at colleges, universities, and correctional facilities across all of Southern Appalachia. With that, I'd like to thank a whole gamut of people. Without the support of these communities, I could not have done this work. I'd like to thank my parents, Rima for providing mentorship throughout this semester and last semester, Jeff Keith for being a one-of-a-kind advisor for the past 4 years, the training at the Inside Out Center, Academic Affairs for supporting that trip, of course my network of friends and community here, and most importantly, the voices that I tried to give voice to, but will never truly be able to, the 2.2 million people who are incarcerated and the people living here in Southern Appalachia. And with that, I'd like to leave y'all with one last quote from Miles Horton, which is that the greatest education comes from action, and the greatest action is the struggle for justice. With that, are there any questions?
I'm curious, what sort of thing would you study in an Inside Out class, or does it matter?
Right, so like I said, it was originally started within Criminal Justice Department at Temple, but currently people are teaching anything. There's ranging from, Victorian English classes to classes around criminal justice to, global studies courses. There have even been some science courses, which are a lot more limiting just because of access to resources around lab equipment. But people are teaching. There's over 138 institutions in the United States that have Inside Out programs.
You mentioned that there's not much going on in southeastern Appalachia.
Yes.
Is that true, that there's nothing, or is there some of this Inside
There have
Out
been,
stuff?
over the past, since 1997, there have been some programs that have come up, but they're not in Southern Appalachia. So there's been some programs in Western Kentucky, some programs in Eastern North Carolina, but nothing in the region that I've been talking about. There's been zero.
Do you have a way of accounting for that?
Yeah, I talked with, her name is Melissa Cable. She's the research assistant for the Inside Out Center. And so when they train instructors, they try to keep as much data as possible on if they're going to go and if they do go into teaching actual Inside Out. Kelly, then let's see.
I'm wondering what type of, like, if there's a huge range of, like, what people, as far as the inmates that students are working with, like, studying with in these classes, like, what range of charges they have, and if they stop it at a certain point,
Yeah.
like, or if there are students in classes with people who've been, like, convicted of serious felony or like murder or
yeah, definitely. So the only restrictions that Inside Out places on programs is people with sexual assault charges. That is the only sort of their limitations. Is anybody else is welcome to participate, but just because of the extreme stigma around sexual assault charges, that they do not. They sort of do a screen for that, and then the prisons themselves or the correctional facilities oftentimes do their own screens on who they allow to participate in such programs. And then there's also an interview process for both outside students and inside students where the instructor will interview and talk with students prior to sort of the registration for the actual class, just so that the faculty person can get to know and make sure that it's an appropriate sort of like mix of like 12 students and 12 students or 15 students and 15 students.
You've got great data here on the qualitative impact of these programs. I'm wondering if there's enough participants to really get quantitative data on impact, either on recidivism rates or conversely on the non-incarcerated students in the classes and what's really effective there.
I think there definitely is. I didn't have the time or resources to do that qualitative sort of like quantitative research around like getting in touch with alumni. It's a lot easier to get in touch with alumni from outside, of course, than it is from inside, just because of those barriers. And I do know that there's an abundance of resources to do that. I just didn't have the time to do that.
Like to respond to
Oh yeah, like recidivism. Yeah, recidivism is known that educational opportunities do reduce recidivism. The specific Inside Out Prison Exchange Program falls under those post-secondary educational opportunities that students who are incarcerated, if they have the access to those programs, the rate of recidivism decreases drastically.
Differential, I guess, just this about Sure. I guess I'm wondering on that though, whether an Inside Out program is there any evidence that's more effective than just a straight classroom program inside the prison?
From like firsthand accounts, it's been seen to be much more effective in terms of just engaging students because of that connection between people rather than some person purely just going into an incarceration a center to teach rather than it's just a learning environment.
What do you feel like the biggest stumbling block or hurdle for this program is? Is it funding? Is it just getting into the prison? Is it people engaging? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's definitely communications with corrections. Here at Wilson, that's one experience that I've had here over the past semester is that communicating with administration here and faculty here is great and fun and smooth, but then along the way, getting in touch with corrections is the hardest part, and making that plug for corrections so that they could implement it. In terms of funding, it's a pretty low cost thing, especially for places that are close to correctional facilities, like Wilson, we're 5 minutes up the road. But for other places in Southern Appalachia, they could be 2 hours away, and so that could increase, travel costs a lot. But the costs really come down to credits for inside students, paying for credits, and then also the books for inside students. And oftentimes you can get publishing companies to support that through donating books.
Excellent. I think we have time for maybe one more question. I want to ask you one of mine. If, I know she does this. This is excellent. But how does this relate to a larger sort of movement culture within Appalachia, or other things that are happening? Like, could you see Inside Out fitting with a larger trend and speak to that for a second?
I briefly mentioned that, but I didn't want to go into it too much. But there's a lot of programs for education and prison justice programs going on in the Appalachian region, such as this one program in Kentucky called Calls from Home, which provides access to family and friends to calling in to their loved ones who are incarcerated on the radio, because costs to calling in is so expensive, and so they call in on the radio and leave messages. There's other programs such as like Prison Books, which provides opportunities to sending reading material into incarcerated folks, and many other opportunities in Southern Appalachia around sort of prison justice issues.
Time for one more question?
So community-based learning is like kind of that's happening in a lot of places now, right? Which is great. But I was curious about where the instructors are getting their facilitating to train to do that, because it does require a completely different kind of teaching.
So all faculty who would teach through an Inside Out program have to go to this training that I have to go to a training provided by the Inside Out Prison Exchange Program Institute, or it's called the Inside Out Center. And so they provide numerous trainings throughout the year, and so I went to one up in Philadelphia, and I was by far the youngest person there. It was mostly professional instructors, faculty from around the United States and Canada, and actually Canada and England as well. So these trainings are opportunities to, and how the arc of the training goes is that it's outside instruction, and then we actually went into a maximum security prison for 3 days and learned from alumni of the program, and they facilitated a number of different things where they taught us how to teach.
Good. Great job. Okay, as we shuffle around a little and prepare for the next presentation, thank all of you for your attention and your fine questions, and invite up here our third presentation panel from the Margins of the Americas, another piece on pedagogy and identity, but looking at it now at the global level, there in the context of, in this case, Peru. So, without further ado, please welcome Lily Hacker, whose presentation is Bilingual Intercultural Education in Cusco, Rethinking Indigenous Identity and the Peruvian Andes. Lily Hacker.
Thanks, Jeff. Like Jeff said, my name is Lily Hacker, and I did my senior research on bilingual agricultural education in Cusco, Peru. So, to start us off with some context, Cusco is both a city and a region in the highland Peruvian Andes. It's where I studied abroad last spring, and I was living in the city of Cusco. It's right about there, within the larger region in red, and then this whole white area is the nation of Peru. This is a city with a very rich cultural history. It was the capital of the ancient Inca Empire, which was taken over by the Spanish in 1532, when Peru became a Spanish colony. And as you can see from these photos, just walking through the city center, this cultural history is very apparent. Huge colonial Spanish cathedrals stand in contrast to ancient Incan stone walls. The city I found also has a very strong presence of indigenous culture, which is the largest indigenous group in the Peruvian Andes. Many of the citizens of Cusco continue to speak Quechua, which is the native language, dress in their traditional garments, and continue with traditional farming methods. So as the largest major city to Machu Picchu, which are the most famous ruins in Peru, tourism is a huge part of Cusco's economy. I found that this industry enthusiastically displays the indigenous Quechua culture as part of its tourist lure. There are huge marketplaces filled with traditional Andean crafts and weavings that cater to tourists. Women will actually come in from the countryside wearing their traditional dress and carrying their llamas, hoping to take pictures with tourists in exchange for money. I learned, however, from talking to people during my study abroad, that although the tourism industry enthusiastically displays the indigenous culture, this outward pride is often merely surface deep, and it masks an underlying culture of discrimination against the Quechua people that began during colonial times and continues to this day. During colonization, many indigenous people were actually enslaved, forced off their land, which began a cycle of poverty for this cultural group. Today, much of the indigenous population is still living in poverty and is openly excluded from certain professions and academic spaces. So, while living in Cusco, I had the opportunity to work with an alternative intercultural school called Puquisinchis. And the founders of this private school believe that the education system as a societal structure has played a huge role in the marginalization of the Quechua people. They wanted to start an alternative program because they believed that the discriminatory practices and policies of the public education system in Peru had taught children to disrespect the indigenous identity. And therefore has perpetuated the stigma against the Quechua language and culture. And the alternative model chosen by Puquisinchis, this school, is called bilingual intercultural education. This type of educational pedagogy strives to combat discrimination and create harmonious relationships between cultural groups in society by teaching children to respect and value all cultural identities. Throughout the study, I refer to this model as EIB, which is the abbreviated version of its Spanish name, Educación Intercultural Bilingüe. EIB has been defined in many different ways by different educators, but we can better understand this term by dividing it up into its two components: bilingual education and intercultural education. Bilingual education refers to the incorporation of two languages in the classroom setting, in this case, Spanish and Quechua, and it highlights language as a key preserver of culture. Intercultural education, on the other hand, attempts to create peaceful relationships between different cultural groups by encouraging open and effective dialogue between individuals of different backgrounds. It teaches students to respect all cultural identities, including their own, which then helps to improve their individual self-esteem. So, interestingly, there have been several previous attempts by the Peruvian government to implement EIB in rural Cusco. And for various reasons, these prior initiatives were largely unsuccessful in combating stigmatization of the Quechua culture and affirming the indigenous identity. However, the educators of Puquisinchis, this school, believed that when implemented correctly and in the right context, EIB can help to counteract this deeply ingrained stigma against the Quechua language and culture and teach the young people of Cusco that this cultural identity is equally valid. So in 1981, this team of educators founded Puquisinchis, which would be the first urban school in Cusco to implement an EIB curriculum. That brings me to my own research. During my month-long research project in Puquisinchis, I examined the effects of EIB on the formation of cultural identity among the young indigenous students there. And I sought to determine whether this program was actually effective in combating cultural discrimination and affirming the Quechua culture. My research consisted of 2 weeks observing and participating in the Puquisinchis classrooms, as well as 11 personal interviews with school administrators, teachers, and parents of Indigenous students. And through this research, I found that the unique EIB program used in Puki-Sinchis, yes, was largely successful in actually achieving its intended goals. In this study of bilingual intercultural education, I demonstrate how and why this particular EIB program in Puki-Sinchis is more effective than the previous state-run EIB programs in combating discrimination and affirming the Quechua culture. So to tackle this large question, I needed to ask myself a series of smaller questions. First, what were the shortcomings of the previous state-run EIB programs? What was it about these initiatives that caused them to meet so many challenges? Second, is Puki-Sinchis replicating these same pitfalls? And third, what is Puki-Sinchis doing differently, and why is their implementation of EIB more effective? To answer this first question, I needed to explore some of the previous studies of EIB in Cusco, and much of my information on this came from the author Maria Elena Garcia. She's a cultural anthropologist who conducted her research of EIB during the 1990s and early 2000s, focusing on the rural schools of Cusco where these national EIB programs were being implemented. That's a cover of her book right there, Making the Indigenous Citizens, where she published her research. And she found that these past state-run EIB programs were largely unsuccessful in actually combating cultural discrimination and affirming the Indigenous identity. And she identified several key factors that she believed led to these programs' deficiency. First, she notes that the actual method of implementation used in these past EIB reforms was not very effective in actually affirming the Quechua culture. These past programs focused mainly on Quechua language maintenance and used Quechua as the primary language of instruction in class. Although this does highlight the importance of language, it leaves out many other vital aspects of culture, such as knowledge systems, spiritual beliefs, art forms, etc. In her study of EIB in rural Cusco, Garcia also points out a lack of support from parents and community members, as well as a lack of funding, which she believes contributed to these programs' deficiency. She explains that many Quechua parents actually rejected the EIB model because they believed that learning Quechua in school would inhibit their children's ability to learn Spanish, and therefore place them at even more of a disadvantage in a primarily Spanish-speaking society. She also notes that these programs often replicated a hierarchical organization structure that we find in many traditional education systems. That's to say that administrators would look down upon teachers, and teachers would discriminate against the Indigenous students and their parents. Finally, Garcia notes that although these EIB programs may have been well-intentioned, the government wasn't willing to give enough funding to properly implement them. So we will now look at my own research of EIB in Puki-Sinchis. By analyzing the data from my interviews and observation sessions, I found that EIB in Puki-Sinchis differed in many ways from the previous state-run programs of the past. Most notable of these differences was the implementation method. The bilingual component of EIB consists of the Quechua Immersion Program from kindergarten through second grade, after which students take Quechua as an elective course. I found that this immersion program makes the transition to speaking primarily Spanish much easier for Indigenous students, and it teaches children to value the Quechua language at a young age. However, I did find that despite learning to respect the Quechua language early on, many students end up rejecting this language later in their schooling careers after realizing that it's typically associated with poverty. Whereas past EIB initiatives focused almost exclusively on the language component, on Quechua language maintenance, Puki St. G's places much more of an emphasis on the intercultural component. This is incorporated into nearly every aspect of the curriculum in Puki St. G's. They learn traditional music and dance in their elective courses. Quechua-speaking community members will actually come into the school to teach traditional weaving and agriculture classes. Their meals consist of local Andean food, such as potatoes, quinoa, tarwi. However, this intercultural program is not just limited to the Quechua culture, but it stresses the legitimacy of all cultural backgrounds and stresses and pushes students to openly confront issues of race and identity in the classroom. One administrator who I talked to estimated that 30 to 40% of the time in the classroom was spent on personal character development and discussions of social issues. I also found that the urban context of Puki St. G's brought this intercultural component much more meaning. The rural schools of past EIB programs had nearly homogeneous indigenous student bodies, which made it very difficult to teach this cross-cultural communication. Puki St. G's, on the other hand, has a very diverse student body. They have indigenous students, mestizo, which is a mix of indigenous and European, French students, Japanese, Canadian students, students from the US, a whole array of different backgrounds. And I found that the educators in Puki St. G's use this diversity as a way to enhance their intercultural program by encouraging students to share parts of their own cultures and celebrate in this difference, rather than viewing it as a point of conflict. I now have a short video clip of a gym class where the students are learning a traditional Andean dance. Hopefully I won't have to do it. You only have to watch it so many times already. It's okay. Well, in this video, a traditional Andean dance.
There's a lot of stillness. Quiet.
Which is just one example of how they're working to incorporate the Quechua culture into their curriculum. So apart from using a more effective implement for EIB, Puki St. G's has also been able to achieve better funding and better support from parents and community members. They're a private institution, which means they have funding from both the federal government and outside donors such as NGOs and other international organizations. They offer a graduated tuition scale, so families with less money end up paying less to school there. And because Puki St. G's is a private institution and parents choose for their children to attend, this means that they're then generally in support of the EIB program. I also observed more horizontal relationships between because they felt like their voices were being heard and they had more control over their children's education. So for all of these reasons, at the end of my research in Peru, I concluded that yes, Puki St. G's was ultimately successful in achieving their intended goals for the EIB program. This study shows that increase respect for the Quechua culture and teach a greater appreciation for all cultural identities. if we take a step back and look at the study from the bigger picture, it shows us how education reform can be used as a means of social reform and as a means of improving human rights in general. I believe that by transforming the mindset of individuals at an early age and attempting to eliminate these social prejudices, EIB can work to create a more civil and equitable society. While Cusco represents a very obvious example of this type of blatant discrimination, it's clearly not the only case of such injustice in today's world. There are so many other societies that are plagued by similar situations, similar cases of racial and ethnic inequality that could potentially benefit from bilingual intercultural education reform. I believe that the success of EIB in Puki-Sinchis can be used as an inspiration and a model for similar alternative education reforms, not only in Peru, but here in the US and on an international level as well. By teaching respect for all identities, bilingual intercultural education has the potential to create a whole new generation of self-determined world citizens who are equipped with the skills to maintain these peaceful relationships across cultural barriers. I'd like to give a big thanks to Jeff and David, my advisors, for helping me out with my thesis. Also, Christine Swope for Raul Chiappi and Cecilia Duffy, who are the administrators of the Puki-Sinchis, helped me out a lot during my project there. Finally,
like the federal education department, and if they're looking to use this model to start that reform at all within like the public education.
I'm not sure about on a federal level, but they are definitely gaining local recognition. They're actually working as kind of like a pilot educative center right now, and the teachers and administrators in Puki-Sinchis are working with other local, like primarily rural teachers, and trying to promote the methods that they're using in their EIB program because they're working so well. So yeah, they are.
This is sort of a follow-up to that. I think it's really interesting research. Congratulations. I want to ask the selection bias question. So
yes.
The families participating in this have chosen to put their kids into a private system.
Right.
And so you would expect they're more inclined towards supporting cultural education. If you try and mainstream this into a public education system, would it work without that self-selection?
There is a lot of debate about that. Some administrators from the school actually told me that when they implemented the EIB program, specifically the bilingual component, parents actually withdrew their children from the school because they didn't want their children to learn Quechua. So I think there definitely would be some backlash, but I think that if more emphasis was put on the intercultural component as opposed to the bilingual component, it would have much more success because it stresses the legitimacy of all backgrounds and not just focuses on Quechua or Quechua language.
Two questions. One, what size, like what student body is the school? And two, how easy or difficult is it for somebody off the street to get their kid to go to the school?
Right. Well, it's kindergarten through 12th grade. They have two separate campuses. As far as the full student body, I'm not sure on the exact number. I would guess probably around 1,000 for the for both the primary and the secondary, and I would say like they definitely have to be selective in their what's it called? Yeah, in their enrollment. But I think they have kind of like I don't know, a pretty open policy as far as licensing. Yeah.
As kind of a follow-up on that question, how expensive of the school is it? You said that it was private, and do you think that could limit like some of the more impoverished families from getting this experience?
Right. It is a fairly expensive, like, full tuition price, but they offer a graduated tuition scale. So families who have less money will like work out a private payment plan with the administrator. Yeah, financially, basically. Yeah.
So when you say it's selective, is it well recognized enough in its own community that there's actually a wait list for the school, you know, that people can't get in?
Yeah.
Did you look at any similar programs in other colonized countries in Latin America and whether they were better or less effective?
I didn't. I just looked at Peru.
Ben?
Oh, yeah.
Do people debate or discuss the process by which they decide which elements of kind of Quechua culture to celebrate in the school? And are there certain elements of Quechua culture that aren't really seen as worthy of being taught?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a constant discussion going on between the administrators and teachers and actually parents, which is where I observe the like horizontal relationships. They're constantly in debate about what is working and what is not, and like what needs to be changed, which I thought was really cool. There's definitely, like, as far as spiritual beliefs and some other practices, like ayahuasca and San Pedro, like those are not incorporated into the Pucasuchi's curriculum at all, and I think they have good reasons for not incorporating that because they haven't really brought in any part of any spiritual beliefs of any culture. So.
Time to move on to more questions. All right, let's give Lily a big round of applause. All right, as we shuffle a little bit, I want to change out this slideshow and thank you again for your attention, your marvelous questions. Because these tend to break up as soon as they're done, I want to take a brief moment and thank the entire panel. This work is difficult and it's their work. I love about the capstone that we have a chance to really see seniors shine, and we flip around the classroom and you all teach us, and it's been a real pleasure. Round of applause for the entire panel. And here we have a final presentation, Ben Everett from Oaxaca to Occupy Zapatismo as a relevant global force. Please welcome Ben.
In my research, I assert that the Zapatista movement has been a crucial influence and inspiration for countless other subsequent ultra-globalization movements since, without them, many other movements would not have had the tactical groundwork to form cohesive and effective movements. And to demonstrate this, I used case studies of the Oaxaca Commune in 2006 and Occupy Wall Street in 2011. And before getting into my research, I think it's important to give some background on the Zapatista movement. The Zapatistas are based out of Chiapas, Mexico, which is that red dot right there. It's the southernmost state of Mexico. And they're made up mostly of poor and indigenous farmers who have faced different sorts of oppression and racism since the Europeans first came to Mexico in the 1400s. And this has come in the form of having their lands stolen from them, being forced into slave labor, etc. So fast forward to the 1980s, Mexico experienced a debt crisis, and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF,
provided a structural adjustment to bail Mexico out of the debt, and part of this structural adjustment was that Mexico began to liberalize its economy with pressure from the IMF and the U.S. to assimilate into a global capitalist economy. And another condition of this was that Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution was altered, and this was the article that guaranteed indigenous peoples their rights to their communal and traditional lands. So when this was altered, it made that land susceptible to be privatized and thus taken from the rightful owners and then sold back to them at high costs. And then in 1989, the World Coffee Agreement buckled, and many already struggling coffee farmers in Chiapas were forced below the poverty line. And according to political scientist Courtney Jung, the median income dropped 70%. So then in 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement was signed into action. And in short, this was bad for Mexican corn farmers because the Mexican market was flooded with cheap U.S. corn, which vastly outproduces Mexico. And so the Zapatista National Liberation Army rose up in armed insurrection and declared war on the Mexican state in reaction to this. And they have been outspoken against neoliberalism. But unfortunately, 2 weeks after they declared their insurrection, the Mexican army outnumbered them and they retreated back into the jungles of Chiapas. So that's sort of a crash history of the Zapatistas. So 20 years later, why are they important? They're considered to be the first postmodern revolution. This is because of their use of the internet as a tool of their movement. This offered them protection and helped spread their message and information to an international audience. This tactic is part of what has become known as Zapatismo, and Zapatismo is a set of ideals, tactics, and beliefs held by the Zapatistas. Political scientist Thomas Nail wrote in the spring of 2013 a paper called Zapatismo and the Global Origins of Occupy, where he traced the Occupy Wall Street movement to the Zapatistas using 3 elements of Zapatismo, and these were non-hierarchical organizing, consensus decision-making, and the use of political masks. And this has been the groundwork for my research, and I expanded on this by examining the use of technology in the Zapatista movement and in subsequent movements using case studies of Occupy Wall Street and Oaxaca. So why Occupy Wall Street and Oaxaca? Occupy Wall Street was one of the largest and most well-known movements in the U.S. against neoliberalism. It gained a worldwide following, calling attention to corruption in political and economic systems both in the U.S. and across the globe. And it used many aspects of Zapatismo, which I'll discuss later. And the Oaxaca social movement in 2006 was a huge movement wherein people overtook the capital of Oaxaca and ran their own city. But the North American media either did not cover it or reported it as a fringe movement. But it was really important in asserting the rights of indigenous populations to self-determination and autonomy, much like the Zapatista movement. My first case study is of the Oaxaca commune, and Oaxaca is the state right here, and it borders Chiapas directly to the north. And much like Chiapas, it's the home to a large group of indigenous people. It has over 16 different groups of indigenous peoples. And the political climate in the 1980s and 90s and into the 2000s has become very tense. The Institutional Revolutionary Party, which has been in power since the Mexican Revolution ended, has been known to be very corrupt. But in spite of this, the governor of Oaxaca passed something in 1996 called Usos y Costumbres, which gave municipalities the option to offer customary forms of governance based on community-wide assemblies. Then the PRI began to arrest indigenous leaders, accusing them of being part of militant groups staging violent uprisings, even though there was no evidence tying these leaders to these militant groups. So this forced several municipalities to re-adopt nationally recognized political parties, which silenced many indigenous voices. So that's some background of Oaxaca, but my research focused on what happened in 2006. And so in June of 2006, there was a teachers' strike in Oaxaca. This is an annual event as part of negotiations between the school teachers union and the government. The teachers wanted higher wages and better equipped schools for their students. And this usually occurred without incident and was peaceful from both sides. But on June 14th, 2006, unprovoked by the teachers, Governor Ulises Ruiz Ortiz ordered police to go in and dismantle the camp and disperse the teachers from the town center using force. They came in using helicopters and dropped tear gas canisters onto the teachers and then beat teachers who weren't leaving the town square. So it was very violent on the part of the state.
And so Thomas Nail wrote in his work that no movement comes out of nowhere. It is the culmination of years of oppression, and only needs one catalyzing event for that to become a full-fledged movement. And for the Zapatistas, this catalyst was the North American Free Trade Agreement and the annulment of indigenous land rights. And this day was that catalyst for the Oaxaca movement. And after police expelled teachers, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in solidarity with them. They took over government buildings, they took control of the city, and the city government effectively shut down. And this is a picture that I took this summer in Oaxaca, and the banner reads, "The government invents crime and fabricates guilt. Teachers are innocent." And so even though the movement itself only lasted for about 5 months, it shows that this issue is still at the forefront of many people's lives, especially poor and indigenous in Oaxaca. So there are two elements of Zapatismo that I discuss in my paper with regards to Oaxaca. The first is the use of technology. The movement made use of public radio to broadcast messages, meeting times, and speeches, and also to organize and reach large groups of people. This is very reminiscent of the Zapatistas' use of the internet. It was fast, effective, and highly accessible as a form of communication in Oaxaca because many people own radios and the teachers already had their own radio station that they broadcasted from daily. And part of the commune was that there were barricades set up at roads leading in and out of the city at night to keep police and the army out. And the radio was used to communicate to people stationed at these barricades to say where the police had been sighted, and also for the people stationed at the barricades to call into the radio to say that there had been police or the army sighted, so people knew. And it was also used to broadcast lessons to children because they were unable to attend school during the strike. And the use of YouTube by the Oaxaca commune was similar to the Zapatista use of the internet, because it allowed for information that normally could have taken days or weeks to reach an international audience in a matter of minutes. This is because journalists could go in with handheld cameras and shoot raw footage and then immediately upload to YouTube, and it becomes accessible to an international audience, which is very helpful to the movement because, like I mentioned earlier, the U.S. and a lot of North American media wasn't covering this movement. So it provided real-time updates of events for an international audience, like the radio provided real-time updates for local participants and sympathizers. And the second aspect of Zapatismo that I talk about in regards to Oaxaca is non-hierarchical organization and horizontalism. This is embodied through the Popular Assembly of the Peoples of Oaxaca, or APO. And this was formed shortly after the people of Oaxaca took over the city. And Gustavo Esteva, who is a participant in the movement and also an intellectual, is quoted as saying, "APO embodies the transition from resistance to liberation initiated in Oaxaca by Zapatismo." And APO acted as a popular assembly to make decisions with regards to the movement and running the city in the absence of the city government. And it was run through consensus decision-making, which is one of the tactics pioneered by the Zapatistas in the 90s. And APO functioned non-hierarchically, meaning that all participants had equal say in the decisions that were being made. And these ideas of consensus decision-making and non-hierarchical organizing were based off horizontalidad, which the Zapatistas established in their encuentros. Encuentros were international meetings organized by the Zapatistas in opposition to neoliberalism that took place in 1994 and 1996. And the Zapatistas defined horizontalism as an alternative to political parties. The party is made up of officials who represent, educate, and speak for the constituents whom they represent. The party structure is the way in which the power of the state is divided up and executed. The very nature of parties is to be partisan, oppositional, and divide people between conflicting positions. And this idea relates to Oaxaca in that the national political parties, i.e. the PRI, no longer represented the interests of the people, so they rose up and created an alternative outside of party politics based in Zapatismo. And APO and horizontalism were especially beneficial to the movement of autonomy in Oaxaca, according to many participants, because it didn't allow only one single ideology to prevail. It allowed for diversity, the diversity that made up Oaxaca to be represented. And along with the 16 different indigenous groups present in Oaxaca, APO was also made up of over 300 different pre-existing organizations. And this inclusion of such diverse groups offered power and voice to people who traditionally weren't able to attain it. For example, feminist and women's groups joined APO, which thus showed a shift from more traditional patriarchal forms of consensus decision-making present in Oaxaca to more inclusive and radical forms. And this is pioneered from the Zapatistas at the onset of their movement as well. Anthropologist David Graeber wrote of the Zapatistas that one of the main inspirations for new generation of anarchists are the Zapatista autonomous municipalities of Chiapas, communities who have been using the consensus process for thousands of years, only now adopted by revolutionaries to ensure that women and younger people have a voice. So it's really easy to see the Zapatista influence in Oaxaca. Unfortunately, 5 months after the movement began, it was violently repressed by federal police and the city government was reinstated. But as you can see by the photograph that I showed earlier, it's still something that's at the forefront of many people's lives. So my second case study is Occupy Wall Street, and Occupy was one of the largest movements in recent U.S. history. Its weight was felt in the U.S. and subsequently around the globe. And its objectives were not always clearly defined, but loosely outlined as a movement against corruption and corporate interest in politics. And similar to the Zapatistas, they took a broad stance against neoliberalism. Because of many similar tactics and goals, many people, including Naomi Klein, compare Occupy Wall Street to the World Trade Organization protests of 1999. But my research sought to connect Occupy Wall Street to Zapatismo. And as I mentioned earlier, Thomas Neal drew comparisons between them in his work, citing horizontalism, consensus decision-making, and the use of political masks. And I plan to add to this discussion by drawing comparisons and connections between the uses of technology, the Occupy movement, and the Zapatista movement. So, the concept of Occupy Wall Street was from an Adbusters article, and Adbusters is a radical leftist publication from Canada. And in the article, they called for 20,000 people to organize an extended occupation of Wall Street in July of 2011. And their demand was to be democracy, not corporatocracy. They took inspiration from other ultra-globalization movements happening at the time, like the Arab Spring and the Indignados movement of Spain. And it's interesting that they mentioned the Indignados movement because Thomas Neal writes that they claim direct influence from the Zapatistas. So the first thing I'm going to talk about with regards to Occupy Wall Street and Zapatismo is the use of horizontalism. And this is embodied in Occupy Wall Street through the General Assembly. This is sort of Occupy's version of an encuentro. It's a non-hierarchical forum for making decisions regarding the movement. And it needed crowd participation to work because it used what was called the people's microphone because there was a ban on electrically amplified speeches given at the time without a permit. And the people's microphone was where the speaker would be giving a speech and they would say one sentence and then the crowd would repeat that sentence and then the speaker would say another sentence and the crowd would repeat that sentence and this went on and on until the speech was done. And many participants said that this allowed them to internalize what was happening in the meetings and therefore become part of the movement because they were helping to give the speeches. And these general assemblies, like OPPO, strive for an inclusive alternative to party politics, which many participants felt no longer represented their interests. And the GAs had rotating facilitators to help lead meetings to ensure that one view was not being favored or that one faction of the movement was not becoming too powerful. And this sort of large-scale consensus decision-making is very much reminiscent and echoes the process of the encuentros, which shows how global Zapatismo has become, starting out in southern Mexico and then moving to Europe, the Indignados movement, and then back to the U.S. So it's going to be very important. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is the use of technology within the Occupy Wall Street movement. And much like the Zapatistas, Occupy Wall Street relied heavily on technology. Occupy took advantage of advanced social media available to them in the form of Twitter. They used hashtags to communicate with others via Twitter for real-time updates with text and photo. And political scientists Joel Penny and Caroline Dallas sum this up really nicely in their work by saying that the focus on non-hierarchical organization may account for the movement's widespread use of social media platforms in horizontal peer-to-peer fashion and encourage that use of popular participation. And often the hashtag used was hashtag Occupy Wall Street, which came from the original Adbusters article. And this was also often abbreviated to hashtag OWS. And as the movement spread to different cities across the US, the hashtag used for information about a specific city's action was also specific to that area, like hashtag Occupy Oakland, for example, for Oakland, California. And this use of technology really helped to democratize the movement because it allowed anyone to upload information onto Twitter and then tag hashtag Occupy Wall Street, which is very reminiscent of the communal use of the radio and the Haka. And it allowed people to search for the hashtag to see information about meeting times and places and actions, etc. So the Zapatismo principle of technology was used and adjusted by Occupy Wall Street for their own movement, which is what I argue that both Occupy and Oaxaca have done on a larger scale. So, in conclusion, my argument in this research is that the Zapatistas and their methods, tactics, and ideals have been indispensable as an influence to countless other ultra-globalization movements. Without them, many other movements would not have the tactical groundwork to form cohesive and effective movements. I found this to be true in my research through the case studies of Oaxaca Commune and Occupy Wall Street, and I expect that Zapatismo will continue to be a driving force in radical global politics in the future. Thank you.
Questions for Ben? We have time, and that is a delight. So, Paul.
You visited Mexico last summer. What did you do in that visit? Was it focusing on this or was it?
No, I was just doing a study abroad in Puebla for a month, where I attended university for 3 weeks and then week-long service project.
Did you get to the Chiapas region?
No, I went to Oaxaca for a weekend, but that's
I feel like the Zapatistas definitely had a very militant aspect to their movement. Do you think this is something that has also been adopted, or maybe more so in the first case study than the other? I'm just curious what you think about that.
The Zapatistas were definitely really militant when they first sort of came out as a movement, but then, like I said, 2.5 weeks later, they were outnumbered by the Mexican army. So they never actually put their arms down, but they decided to not use them and to adopt more nonviolent tactics. And I think that's why they've become so popular, because they've adopted these other methods.
To my knowledge, in the Zapatista movement, there's the whole mythology of Subcomandante Marcos as kind of like an umbrella term for like each individual within the movement. How does that relate to like this concept in Occupy of like the 99%? Like, do you think there's any sort of connection there, or are those kind of fundamentally different?
I think they're kind of different. I mean, Subcomandante Marcos is sort of seen as the unofficial spokesperson, but he says what the Assembly's Chiapas tell him to say.
But I've always heard that it wasn't actually like, there wasn't actually a single person named Subcomandante Marcos. That's just kind of the persona taken on by anyone who wishes to.
I think that's why the use of masks is important in the Zapatista movement, because they sort of say everybody's Marcos and nobody's Marcos. So I guess, yes, it sort of relates to the use of the 99%, that sort of umbrella identity.
Yeah, it's interesting work. The parallels that you point out are largely in tactics between the two movements. The form of organization, masks, the general meeting hall. But you see those in other revolutionary movements that have occupied public spaces back Tiananmen Square, Arab Spring, Orange Revolution, all of those. And it seems to me that some of the real parallel here is on the ideology, the anti-globalism, anti-liberal ideology. So where do you see the transmission happening from Zapatista to Occupy Wall Street? Was it conscious on their part, or is it sort of coincidental and accidental rediscovery?
I think it's a fairly conscious thing. David Graeber, who's an anthropologist, writes a lot about Zapatista tactics, and he was also very involved in Occupy from the get-go. And so I think that those influences are definitely there. They're definitely very consciously made.
And to follow that, one thing that is very different now is that truly that non-hierarchical structure is there. People have the internet in their pocket. I'm wondering, that's kind of the debate that's been raging. And Malcolm Gladwell came out and said, no, it's not. Social media is not having an impact. Others say we're seeing it right now in Ukraine. So I'm wondering, in your research, where do you fall in that debate about the role of social media as sort of enabling some of these actions?
I think it's definitely had an impact because so many people have access to it. It really makes information out there available to not everybody, and there's still a certain amount of privilege involved, and that's problematic. But to a very large group of people, this information is available. All you have to do is search hashtag Occupy Wall Street, and that's the things. Anybody else?
There are a couple more questions. We don't have. Hashtag Stoke. Thank you, and I want to thank the guests on the panel. We're ending a little early, so let's keep in mind that there are ongoing presentations when we leave. It can be very frustrating when a burst of noise comes from the back. So thanks very much for coming, and we'll see you at other panels. There's another Global Studies panel I want to be able to plug at 12:30 in the lecture hall. So maybe I'll see you there. I hope I see you elsewhere too. Take care.